Hey everyone, it's Jen B, and welcome to my studio. Today's video is going to be a slightly longer video. I'm going to be taking you along with me as I turn this lovely blue lace agate stone into a pendant. The idea I have for it is to combine something kind of feminine, but with a little funky twist to it, and you will see what that looks like as we go along in the process. So this is the stone, and putting that aside and showing you the bezel wire that I'm going to be using, I had already cut it down to the size that I needed to fit the stone before I decided to hit record. And of course, I'm going to use some balls because I love to put balls in my jewelry. I just can't help myself. Alright, so here we go. I am starting to gather some tools that I will need to get the ends of the bezel wire completely flush with each other. If the ends of the bezel wire aren't completely aligned, then the solder won't flow very well and there won't be a nice strong join between them. So I'm using a device called a miter cutting jig, and I'm putting my wire into it, screwing it down, and then I'm going to use a cheap file with a Prosecco cork as my handle and file away the very edge of the bezel wire. This will make it have a perfectly 90-degree angle and be flat and perfect. So I just keep filing away until there is no more metal left to file on top of the miter vise. Alright, and I do the other edge off camera, and now I am working at getting both ends of the bezel wire to sit perfectly in contact with each other. Takes a little bit of fiddling, making sure that they are just perfectly aligned. So I fiddle some more, look, fiddle. That's kind of the whole process. And once it's just right, we'll head over to the soldering board. And I'm starting to heat up the bezel wire, spray it with some flux, and starting to get it ready to solder. Heating, spinning so that I get all sides of the bezel wire warmed up. And here I'm going to show you the solder. Little tiny solder chips, very sparkly and pretty. I'm just going to put a couple of the solder chips next to the solder seam. And then here momentarily, I'm going to zoom in so you get a little bit better of a look. There we go. And I'm going to put the solder seam directly on top of the solder chips. Get my torch on it. And here very, very soon, keep your eyes on those solder chips because they are going to jump into the seam right there. And then I just turn it around and touch the outside of the seam with my flame just to draw the solder through. Back over at my bench pin, I've got the bezel wire formed around the stone, and I'm just checking for any gaps. I do see a gap right up there at the top, so I'll use some pliers just to gently push and form the bezel wire to the stone. And once that's accomplished, then you will see me starting to prepare the back plate. I'm using 24 gauge wire here because it's going to be a pendant, so it's not going to get a lot of wear and tear on it. So I feel confident that 24 gauge is going to be sufficient for this. I put a little lubricant on my saw blade, and I am just going to saw as straight a line as I can, just to cut off that little end piece of metal that I don't need. And I should accomplish that here momentarily. There, we got through the metal. Okay, good job, Jen. And next, I'm going to be pulling out a clipboard that has a bunch of different grits of sandpaper on it. and I'm going to use the sandpaper and a sanding tool to sand the bottom of the bezel flush. I want it to be sitting perfectly flat on the back plate so that there is a perfect solder join. So I file, and then I'm going to check and make sure that it's looking good.
Come here, Bella.
And I think it's looking good. All right. One last thing to do to prepare the back plate is to give it a nice little buff and take off any markers, any grime, any oxidation in order to prepare it for soldering. We really want the metal clean, so getting all of that grime off is essential. There was a little piece of tape left on there, but it won't be in the way of the solder. Over at my soldering board now, I am working on getting the bezel soldered down to the back plate. I've got some chips of solder on the inside of the bezel, and I'm heating from underneath, coming up over the top occasionally, trying to be very, very careful not to melt the bezel wire. There are some pretty thin parts of the bezel wire because it's a decorative wire, so I'm really trying to be careful not to melt it. I'm using my pick every so often to gently push down on the bezel, making sure that it has contact with the back plate. And this is kind of just a rinse and repeat, going around, getting the metal hot enough, getting it all up to temperature for the solder to flow, and you'll see as we go around, the solder is flowing. Couple little stubborn pieces in there that didn't flow. I'm going to assume that's because they weren't right up against the bezel, but that's okay, I took care of them later. Alright, so I pickled the metal, and now it is back over at the soldering area. I've got it upside down on my soldering board. And we're going to get ready to put the balls on. So first things first, I'm going to heat it up. Or rather, I'm going to heat up the back and spray it with flux. This is going to protect the back from getting any fire stain. Flipping it over, you can see the beautiful bezel there. And all those little black marks on it are where I'm going to put solder chips and then balls on those solder chips. So right now I'm just preparing everything, getting it nice and warmed up, and getting it ready for the solder. I'll add the solder eventually. I guess I just got too involved at the flame. This clip turned out to be a little longer. Alright, preparing my solder. I've got a little bowl there in that flour of some flux, and I'm going to dip my solder pieces into the flux and place them in the area of the little black marks that I had created. Bigger chips for bigger balls, smaller chips for smaller balls. And I just keep doing that all the way around, and then we'll get my torch fired up, and I will start to flow that solder to make little tiny pools of solder that I'll then put the balls on top of. So I'm just going around making sure all of the solder chips are positioned where I want them, heating underneath and on the top, trying to get the whole piece up to temperature so that the solder chips will turn into little puddles of solder. And also not melt that bezel. That's real important. You can see if you're watching closely, some of the solder chips are starting to form into puddles. I have a couple stubborn pieces that I'm going to go back around and touch with my flame, but you can see we're really getting some good puddling now. The side that I'm coming up on was being a little stubborn, so I go past it and then come back to see if I can get those to flow. And there they go. They're starting to turn into little puddles. All right, we did it. So, I think I pickled this piece. Maybe, maybe not. I think I did. Let's see. Yeah, I think I did pickle it some. And here I am placing the balls onto the pools of solder. And I tried not to be super intentional about this. I have a tendency to want things to be absolutely perfect and symmetrical. But I'm just kind of going with it and just placing balls where there are solder puddles, and I'm just going to go with it instead of being a perfectionist about it. So, turning on my torch, and we are going to reflow the solder so that the balls sitting on top of the solder get sucked down to the back plate. So I'm heating. Everything had been fluxed. I think I dipped the balls in flux before I put them onto the back plate. So you'll see some of the balls turning white, and that's the flux. So we just go round and round, heating, again being careful not to melt the bezel wire. We're getting very close up to temperature. And that solder is going to start to flow here momentarily. There it goes. I can see it. Hopefully you can see it. You kind of know what to look for after a while. And I just go around and around, making sure that all the balls are soldered down. After that, I pickle the piece and I head back over to my bench pin, and I'm going to saw it out. I drew around the entire piece with a thin Sharpie marker, and I'm just following that line as best I can. I do saw with my saw blade off to the side rather than directly in front of me. That was a tip that I got from someone who, well, let's just say she's another lady silversmith, and sometimes having your saw blade off to the side is a lot easier than directly in front of you. So I just keep going round and around. I use a little paintbrush occasionally to move any silver dust out of my way so that I can see that line. Okay, so coming up next, once it's all sawed out, I'm going to be using a little file and just going around the edges and refining the shape of those balls. And then I think I take an even smaller file and get in those crevices so that everything is nice and perfect. Or as perfect as I can make it, I suppose. After I've filed it, we are going to do the final soldering operation, and that is attaching the bail and a little cartouche. So you can see I've already got the bail in position there. It's just a piece of flattened round wire that I formed into a little question mark shape. So I'm spraying it with spray flux, getting my little cartouche that already has solder placed on the back, or melted on the back, I suppose. Getting that into place, we'll get everything fluxed up, and then we'll start to heat it all up to temperature, add some solder, and we'll be good to go. I did get a little off camera during this part of the filming, and I apologize about that. Something I'll work on in the future. But for now, I think you get the gist. Okay, the solder chips were added, and I've got my flame turned back on, adding just a little bit more spray flux. And we're going to heat it up and get that solder to flow. And it's flowing probably right about now. I'm sorry you can't see it too well. I'm about to use my pick and poke at things and make sure that it is all secure. So there it is, the piece has been pickled, and now I'm going to work on polishing it. I'm using something called a radial disc brush here, and it's a pretty high grit, low grit, high grit, low grit. I'm not really sure that terminology. I don't like my pieces to be very polished, so I don't use a very fine grit to get a high polish on my pieces. I like that kind of more satin, aged look, I suppose. And so I'm just going around here using that radial disc and taking out any of the major scratches. And now I'm mixing up some stinky water, as my son likes to call it. It's just liver of sulfur, and this is going to oxidize and patina my metal, giving it that nice dark gray color. So I'm just dipping and swishing. It was really cold in my studio that day, so I don't think the liver of sulfur was working as well as I wanted it to. Works best when it's warm. And then I am dipping or dropping the piece into my tumbler with some tumbling medium. Getting that all secure, we'll tumble that. And then there's the finished piece. I unfortunately did not hit record as I was setting the stone. But, c'est la vie. All right, here we go, my beautiful blue lace agate pendant. I love that the bezel wire gives it like this beautiful feminine touch, and the random balls give it kind of a carefree touch. I think it's just perfect. I love it, and I've already worn it several times, and I hope that you like it and enjoyed my video. Thanks so much for joining me. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.